The formula suggests the following. First, determine the total number of people that are present. Secondly, calculate 1% of that total number. In other words, multiply that number by 0.01. Thirdly, calculate the square root of that 1%. Well, this formula produces numbers that are smaller than we might expect. So, for example, in the city of 1 million people, the number required to jumpstart the experience of peace is only about 100. In a world of 6 billion people, that number is only about 8,000. And this number represents only the minimum number needed to begin the process. Obviously, the more people that are involved, the faster the effect is created. While these and similar studies obviously deserve more exploration, they do show us that there's an effect and that effect is beyond chance. That effect is summarized in key number 16 of our exploration of the divine matrix. The key simply states that the minimum number of people required to jumpstart a change in consciousness is the square root of 1% of a population. Maybe this is the reason that so many wisdom traditions emphasize the importance of each individual to the whole. In one of the best-known parables of the power of belief, Jesus used the holographic principle to illustrate how just a little faith is all that's required to open the door to a greater possibility. In words that are simple and direct, he stated, quote, "I tell you the truth. If you have the faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, 'Mountain, move,' and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you." End of quote. We'll explore the implications of just what this means in the following section, but before we do, a brief clarification of faith, I think, is appropriate here. The word faith itself can sometimes carry a bit of an emotional charge, as it's often associated with a belief that has no apparent foundation or basis to support it. We commonly hear this kind of belief referred to as blind faith. My sense is that there really is no such thing as absolutely blind faith, that somewhere deep inside of us, all of our beliefs come from the feeling of a deeper connection between the things that are and the things that can be. While we may not always be conscious of our beliefs or able to state the words of why we believe something is so, our beliefs are true for us, and that truth is the foundation of faith. There is a kind of faith, however, that's actually based in a very solid foundation of leading-edge science, supported by the discoveries of quantum physics. Previously, we discussed why it is that the physical world is changed by simply observing it. As the experiments showed, it's the act of us watching something, conscious observation, that locks one of the possibilities into place as what becomes our reality. In other words, the expectation or the belief that we have while we are observing is the ingredient that chooses which possibility becomes the real experience in our lives. Well, with this in mind, the faith in Jesus' statement is more than simply saying the words that the mountain is moved. In a parable that's nearly 2,000 years old, we're taught a powerful language with which to choose reality from the infinite possibilities that already exist. As Neville states so clearly in his description of faith, through the act of persisting in the assumption that your desire is already fulfilled, your world inevitably conforms to your assumption. In the example of the mountain, when we truly know that it is already moved, our faith, our belief, our assumption that it has happened is the energy that jolts that possibility into the reality that we experience. In the quantum realm of all possibilities, the mountain has no choice. It must move. When I share such studies with live audiences, they're commonly met with a gasp that comes from somewhere between wanting to believe and the frustration that's expressed as a thinking that says, this is just too simple. It cannot be this simple. My response is this: why would we expect anything less? In the holographic world of the divine matrix, all things are possible, and we choose our possibilities. Believing that we are here and that the possibilities are out there, however, sometimes gives us the feeling that they're inaccessible. The same rules that describe how the divine matrix works also tell us that in the deeper reality, what we typically think of as somewhere else is really already here and vice versa. It's all about the way we see ourselves in the field of all possibilities. Knowing that everything from the most horrible suffering to the most joyous ecstasy and everything between already exists, it makes perfect sense that we have the power to choose which of those possibilities we bring into our lives. And we do so through the silent language of imagination, dreams, and belief. Chapter 5. When here is there and then is now, jumping time and space in the matrix. The poet Henry Van Dyke described the irony of our relationship to time in words that have remained long after his death early in the 20th century. Time is too slow for those who wait, he began. It's too swift for those who fear, too long for those who grieve, too short for those who rejoice. But for those who love, time is an eternity. Well, true to Van Dyke's words, time is perhaps the most elusive of all human experiences. We can't capture it or photograph it. Contrary to what daylight savings would seem to imply, it's impossible to gather time in one place only to use it later in another place. When we do attempt to describe the meaning of time in our lives, we're left to use words that gauge time in a relative sense. We say that something happened then in the past, or that it's happening now in the present, or it will happen at some point in the future. The only way we can describe time, it seems, is through the things that happen within that time. Until the 20th century, in the Western world, time was typically thought of in a poetic sense, as an artifact of human experience. Philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre described our relationship with time as what he called a special kind of separation, a division that reunites. But that poetic view changed in 1905 when Einstein published his theory of relativity. Before relativity, time was believed to be its own experience, separate from the three dimensions of height, length, and width that define space. In his theory, however, Einstein said time and space are intimately entwined and cannot be separated. It's time and space together, he said, that forms a realm beyond our familiar three-dimensional experience, what he called the fourth dimension. Suddenly, time became more than a casual philosophical concept. It was a force to reckon with. In words that brought new meaning to our perception of time, Einstein described its mysterious nature by simply stating the obvious. He said, quote, "The distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion," end of quote. Well, with these powerful words, Einstein forever changed the way we think of our relationship with time. Just consider the implications. If the past and the future are present in this moment, can we communicate with them? Can we travel in time? Well, even before Einstein's bold statements, the possibilities that this question poses intrigue scientists, mystics, and writers. From hidden temples in Egypt dedicated to the experience of time, to the thrill of H.G. Wells' 1895 classic novel, The Time Machine, the prospect of having the ability to hitch a ride somehow on the flow of time has captured our imaginations and our dreams. Our fascination with time is as old as our existence, and our questions about time seem endless. Is it real? Does it exist without us? Is there something about consciousness that gives time its meaning? And if so, do we have the power or the right to interrupt the forward flow of time long enough to glimpse the future, perhaps even to visit and communicate with people in the past? Can we communicate with other realms and even other worlds in which we share the present? Well, in light of accounts such as the one that follows, the boundary between here and there becomes less clear, and it invites us to reconsider just what time really means in our lives. A message from beyond time. In Jutta Halberstam and Judith Leventhal's powerful book, Small Miracles, Extraordinary Coincidences from Everyday Life, they share an amazing story of the power of forgiveness. And while I've done my very best to capture the essence of this awe-inspiring account, I do encourage you to experience it in its entirety through the original text. But what makes this story so interesting, and the reason I offer it here, is that in this case, forgiveness is so powerful that it even transcends time. It's the story of a young Jewish boy named Joey and the relationship that he had with his father that transcended even death. Joey and his father had not spoken since he turned 19. It was at that time that Joey began to question his family's traditional Jewish beliefs. To his father, there could be no greater disgrace than for his son to question such a time-honored philosophy. So he threatened to end his relationship with his son unless Joey accepted his traditional roots and stopped the questioning. Joey found that he couldn't meet his father's demands, so he left home to explore the world on his own, and he and his father never spoke again. Well, it was in a small cafe in India when a friend found Joey and shared the news of his father's death. This was the first time that Joey knew of his father's passing. He immediately returned home and he began to explore his Jewish roots and his father's friends. Deeply moved by new insights into his heritage and his father's life, Joey soon found himself making plans for a personal pilgrimage to the land where the roots of his family's traditions began. He was on his way to Israel. This is where the story takes a deep and mystical turn and offers us insight into the power of the divine matrix. Joey found himself at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. This is the portion of an ancient temple wall that remains following its destruction nearly 2,000 years ago. And it's here that Orthodox Jews go to pray every day, repeating the same words of the same prayers that have been spoken for centuries. Joey had written a note to his father, declaring his love and asking forgiveness for the pain that he'd caused in his family. Well, following the custom, he'd planned to leave his note in one of the many cracks and crevices that were formed when the original mortar fell away from between the stones. It was when he found just the right place to leave his note that something amazing happened, something that has no rational explanation in the eyes of traditional Western science. As Joey placed his note into the wall, another paper suddenly fell from its place between the stones. It was a prayer that someone else had written and placed in precisely the same location in the wall days or possibly even months before. The prayer landed at Joey's feet, and as he reached for the rolled-up note, an odd feeling came over him. As he opened the note and began to read its contents, he recognized the handwriting. It was his father's. The note in his hand was the one that Joey's father had written and left in the wall before his death. In it, he had declared his love for his son and he'd asked God for forgiveness. And at some time in the not-too-distant past, Joey's father had traveled to precisely the place where Joey found himself in that moment, and in an ironic twist of synchronicity, he had placed his prayer in precisely the location within the wall where it remained until the day that Joey walked by. What a powerful story. How could such an extraordinary thing have happened? Obviously, there must be some kind of communication happening between realities and worlds. Joey lives in the realm of the present that we call our world, and although his father is no longer alive, traditional Judaism presumes that he still exists in another realm, in heaven, which lies beyond our world. In the traditions, both realms are believed to coexist in the present and to be in communication with one another. So while the mechanics of precisely how Joey's father communicated with him may remain a mystery, one thing is certain. For Joey to receive an indication that his father still exists, there must be something that connects both of them, some medium that provides the container for both realms of experience. The divine matrix is that medium. It fits the description of the place that the ancient Jews called heaven, the home of the soul that is the container for the past, the present, and the future. Through the bridge of the divine matrix, something beautiful and precious transpired between Joey and his father that day. Transcending time, space, and in this story, even life and death, a communication occurred that brought healing and completion between a father and his son. We must look even deeper into our relationship with the space that creates here and there, and the time that allows for then and now to understand how it happened and why. When here is there. If, as the experiments suggest, our universe and everything in it are truly held within the container of this divine matrix, then we may soon find ourselves redefining our ideas of space as well as time. We may even discover that the distances that seem to separate us from one another and our loved ones only separate our bodies. As we saw in the story of Joey and his father, something within us is not bound by distance or limited by the laws of physics as we know those laws today. While these possibilities may sound like the stuff of science fiction, They're also the subject of serious scientific investigation. So serious, in fact, that during the last years of the Cold War, both the United States and the former Soviet Union devoted tremendous amounts of money and time and research to understand precisely how real the matrix that connects everything really is. Specifically, the superpowers wanted to know if it's possible to navigate great distances through the matrix by using the inner sight of the mind, our psychic abilities of telepathy known as remote viewing. The results may sound surprisingly similar to some popular movies of recent years. They may, in fact, be the basis for the plots of these movies. The experiments also make the already fuzzy line between fiction and fact even fuzzier than ever. The United States officially began investigating the possibility of using psychic methods to surf the divine matrix and see into distant lands and enemy targets in 1970. It was then that the CIA funded the early experiments using psychically sensitive people, called empaths, to focus their minds upon classified locations throughout the world. Once there, they were trained to go through a series of increasingly greater detail in their mind to describe what they found. The project was given the acronym SCANATE, short for Scan by Coordinate. This program was one of the precursors that led to the now famous studies at the Stanford Research Institute on remote viewing. Although in some respects remote viewing may sound a little out there to some people, it's actually based on very sound principles, some that we've already explored in this program. Even the experts acknowledge that no one knows precisely how remote viewing really works. In general, however, its success is attributed to the idea from quantum physics that while things may look solid and separate to us, everything exists and is connected to everything else as part of the universal field of energy. So while we may hold a beautiful seashell in our hand, for example, from a quantum perspective, there's an energetic part of that shell that extends beyond our hand. It's everywhere. Because our seashell exists beyond the local place where we hold it, it's said to be non-local. Well, a growing number of scientists accept the experimental evidence that the universe, our world, and even our bodies are non-local. We're everywhere already and always. As Russell Targ stated previously, even though we may physically be separated from one another, we can still be in instantaneous communication with other people. It's this instantaneous communication that remote viewing is all about. In effect, viewers in the CIA programs were taught how to have what we call a waking or a lucid dream. In their altered state, they gave their consciousness the freedom to focus upon precise locations in the matrix. Sometimes the locations were in another room of the same building, sometimes they were on the other side of the world. Clarifying the connectedness of our universe in this quantum realm, the Stanford Research Institute co-founder, Russell Targ, states, "It's no harder to describe what's happening in the far reaches of the Soviet Union than it is to describe what's happening across the street." The trainees of the program received as much as 3 years of instruction before they were deployed in these secret missions. Well, the details of the United States military's remote viewing projects have been made available to the general public only recently, and they describe at least 2 kinds of remote viewing sessions. I'm sharing them here because they tell us just how real this divine matrix really is. The first of these programs is called Coordinate Remote Viewing, and it involves viewers describing what they find at specific geographic coordinates, identified by things like latitude and longitude. The second kind of program is called Extended Remote Viewing, and it's based upon a series of relaxation and meditative techniques that allow our awareness to move through the field of the divine matrix. Although the specifics may vary from technique to technique, in general, all the remote viewing procedures usually begin with the viewer in a mild state of relaxation. It's from this state that they appear to be more open to receiving sensory impressions from these distant locations. During the sessions, another person is generally involved as what you could think of as a guide. The guide's role is to help the viewer by prompting him or her to look at specific details in their lucid or waking dream. Through a series of protocols that allow the viewer to distinguish which of the impressions are important for whatever their mission is, The viewer is able to describe what they see in increasingly deeper levels of detail. So the prompting of this guide seems to separate this form of controlled remote viewing from the lucid dreaming that often happens spontaneously in our sleep. The implications for secrecy of remote viewing are immense, and they open the door to a new era of intelligence gathering with fewer risks to people on the ground. That is until the remote viewing programs were shut down in the mid-1990s. With intriguing project names like Project Stargate, the last remote viewing program was officially terminated in 1995. Although the process was considered by some people to be a fringe science, and even discounted altogether by some military skeptics, a number of remote viewing sessions were validated. They were so successful they could not be attributed to coincidence. Some of them may have even saved lives. During the first Gulf War in 1991, for example, remote viewers were asked to search for enemy missile locations hidden in the deserts of western Iraq. The project successfully pinpointed specific missile sites, and it eliminated other locations from consideration. Well, the benefits of such a psychic search are obvious. By narrowing down the possible locations where those weapons could be located, everything from time and energy and money was saved. The greatest benefit, however, was to the lives of the troops themselves. The remote search for deadly missiles reduced the risk to troops that traditionally would have had to perform those searches on the ground. And the reason I mention these projects and the techniques is because they were so successful. They demonstrated two things that are key in our understanding of the divine matrix. First, it's yet another indication that the matrix exists. For a part of us to travel to distant locations and for our consciousness to see the details of things that are very real without us ever leaving the chair that we're sitting in, there must be something for our awareness to travel through. So my main point here is that the viewer has access to the destination regardless of where it is. Secondly, the very nature of the energy that makes remote viewing possible demonstrates the holographic connectedness that appears to be a part of who we are. In the presence of the divine matrix, the old ideas of who we are and how we function in time-space begin to break down. The language that mirrors reality. Regardless of whether or not we influence the past, it's clear that the choices we make today determine the present and the future. And all three, past, present, and future, exist within this container of the divine matrix. As part of the matrix, it makes perfect sense that we would be able to communicate with it in a way that's meaningful and useful in our lives. According to scientific experiments, as well as our most cherished traditions, we do. The common denominator to the experiments in the previous chapters is twofold. Number one, they show us that we're part of the divine matrix. And number two, and this is so powerful, they show us that the human emotion, the beliefs, the expectations, and the feelings are the language that the divine matrix recognizes. Interestingly, though maybe coincidentally, these are the very experiences that were actually edited from the early Christian biblical texts. They're the experiences that have been discouraged in Western culture. Today, however, all that's changing. Men are being encouraged to honor their emotions and their feelings and their beliefs, and women are being encouraged to explore new ways to express the power that's such a natural part of their existence. It's clear that emotion and feeling and belief are the language of this matrix, and that there's a quality of these things that allows us to experience the field of energy that connects the universe in ways that are powerful and healing and natural. So the question is, if we are speaking to the divine matrix, how do we know when it answers us? If our feelings, our emotions and beliefs and prayers are providing the blueprint for the quantum stuff that the universe is made of, then what are our bodies and our lives and our relationships telling us about our part of the conversation? Well, to answer this question, we've got to recognize the second half of our dialogue with the universe. How do we read the messages from the divine matrix? Chapter 6. The universe is talking to us. Messages from the matrix. While we speak to the divine matrix through the language of feeling and belief, previous chapters also describe how the matrix answers us through the events of life. It's in this never-ending dialogue that our deepest beliefs become the blueprint for everything that we experience. And because the conversation never stops, it's impossible for us to ever simply be observers on the sidelines of life. If we're conscious, we're engaged in the conversation, so by definition, we're always creating. Sometimes the conversation is subtle, sometimes it's not. Regardless of the degree of subtlety, however, life in a reflected universe promises that from our challenges to our joys, the world is nothing more and nothing less than the matrix, mirroring our deepest and truest beliefs. And this includes the mirrors of our most intimate relationships. Although they do present honest reflections, sometimes seeing ourselves mirrored in other people can be the most difficult reflections to accept. They can also be the fast track to our greatest healing. Our reflected reality. In 1998, I had an experience in Tibet that offers a powerful metaphor for the way this quantum conversation with reality works. On the way into the capital city of Lhasa, our tour group was driving around a bend in the road that led to a small lake at the base of a cliff. The air that morning was absolutely still, allowing the water to hold a perfect reflection of everything in the area. Well, from our vantage point, I could see the reflection of a huge Buddha mirrored in the water. And while I knew that the statue itself was somewhere in the cliff overlooking that lake, in that moment, I couldn't see the carving. All I could see was the reflection. It was only when we came around the curve and the road leveled out that I could see with my eyes what I had only imagined as the source of the reflection in my mind. And there it was. Carved in high relief, it was the most beautiful Buddha towering above the lake, liberated from that living rock as a silent witness to all who passed. Well, in that moment, the reflection in the lake became a metaphor to me for the way we experience our visible world. As we were coming around the curve and I saw the Buddha in the water, the reflection was the only way that I knew a statue existed. Although I suspected that it was mirroring something carved somewhere in the rock, from my vantage point, I simply couldn't see it. Well, in a similar way, the everyday world is said to be the reflection of a deeper reality, carved into the fabric of our universe, a reality that we just can't see from our place in the world. As mentioned previously, both ancient wisdom and modern science suggest that what we see as the visible relationships of life are nothing more and nothing less than the reflection of things that are happening in another realm. And just as surely as I knew that the image in the water reflected something that was real and solid, we can be sure that our lives are telling us about events happening in another realm of existence. Just because we can't see these events, however, doesn't mean they aren't real. In fact, ancient traditions suggest that this unseen world is even more real than the visible world. As David Bohm said, we simply can't see this deeper reality from where we are in time and space. Even though we may not be able to see directly into this invisible realm, we do have some indication of what's happening there, because we see its reflection in our everyday lives. And from this perspective, our daily experiences serve as messages from these deeper realms, messages from within the divine matrix itself. And just as we must understand the language of any communication, to know what its message says, we must recognize the language of the divine matrix so that we can benefit from what it's telling us. Sometimes the way the messages come through are direct, cannot be mistaken, while at other times, however, they're so subtle we miss them altogether. Often, however, we may think that we're being shown one thing when in fact the message is really telling us something very, very different. Things are not always what they seem. In his pioneering book, Journey to Ixtlan, anthropologist Carlos Castaneda learned very quickly that he could not trust the filters of his own perceptions the way he'd been conditioned to do in the past. He discovered that the everyday world is alive on levels that are both seen as well as unseen. Castaneda had always been taught, for example, that when the bushes move beside you and you feel a cool air brushing against your face, that it's the wind that's doing the moving. Well, in a poignant teaching that's remained with me for years, Castaneda's mentor, a Yaqui Indian sorcerer named Don Juan, reminded his student that it may very possibly be the wind, or he also reminded Castaneda that what feels like the wind may actually be something else, something much more intimate, much more powerful. Castaneda describes his lesson by sharing his experience of a brief yet powerful moment in the Sonoran Desert. A sudden gust of wind hit me at that instant, he begins, and it made my eyes burn. I stared toward the area in question. There was absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. I can't see a thing, I said. You just felt it, his teacher replied. What, the wind? Castaneda asks. It's not just the wind, the teacher replies. It may seem to be the wind to you, because the wind is all you know. In the simplicity of a few words, the Yaqui master must first acknowledge the obvious, that the breeze may actually be nothing more than a cool desert wind. But then he opens the door to an even deeper possibility, that the feeling of a cool breeze flowing through Castaneda's hair may be the energy of a spirit making itself known in that moment. Quickly, Castaneda learned that from that moment forward, he could never assume that the feeling of air moving around him was simply the wind ever again. Well, the key here is that if we don't know that there's another possibility, we will always try to fit our experiences into the context of things that we do know, what we've already learned. Through our filters of perception, we do our best to fit our romances, friendships, finances, and health into the boundaries of the things that we do know, and give them the meanings that past experiences have already established. Although the boundaries may work to some degree, how well do they serve us really? How many times, for example, have we reacted to something in life based on what we learned from someone else rather than on what our own lives have taught us? How many times have we prevented ourselves from having deeper relationships or more fulfilling jobs because an opportunity that crossed our path looked like something that we remember from our past, and we bolted in the opposite direction from the experience? We are tuned to our world. Within the context of the divine matrix, it's easy to understand how we're part of all that we see and experience. If our connection to everything in our world runs so deep, then it makes tremendous sense that we should see evidence of that connection every single day. Well, maybe we do. And maybe we see it each and every day, only in ways that we may not always recognize. Sometimes we may not even notice them. Let's look at an example of just what I mean here. We all know, for example, that the longer we're in the presence of the people, places, and things that surround us, the more comfortable we feel with them. For most people, walking into the living room of a family home, for example, certainly feels more comfortable than walking into the living room of a hotel in another city. We've all experienced something like this before. Even though the hotel may be newer and have all the latest fabrics and carpet and upholstery, it just doesn't feel like home to us. And when we have this kind of experience, what we know is comfort comes from a fine tuning of the subtle energy that brings us into balance with our world. We call that balance resonance. Well, to some degree, we're in resonance with everything in our world. From our cars to our homes, and even the appliances that we rely on every day, we're tuned to the world around us in ways perhaps we're only beginning to understand. This is why we can affect other people in our surroundings simply through our presence. Well, it should come as no surprise then that when something changes within us or within the things that surround us, that those changes will show up in our lives as well, and they do. Sometimes the changes come in ways that are subtle. In 1995, for example, I had an American-made car that had over 300,000 miles on the original engine. I'd always done my very best to take care of my old friend, and it ran and looked like a brand new car. While it always started, and it ran perfectly for me, it never failed to break down whenever I loaned it to someone else. Within hours of loaning it to a friend, a new noise would suddenly begin in the engine, or a warning light would appear on the dashboard, or the car would just simply stop running as someone else with a different touch took over as a driver. Just as certainly, when I would slip back into that driver's seat and take it to the mechanic, the problem would simply heal itself and mysteriously disappear. While the mechanic assured me that these things really happen all the time, I knew that after a few such false alarms, he started to have second thoughts about me whenever he'd see my 300,000-mile Pontiac drive into his parking lot. But while I can't prove it scientifically, I've talked to enough other people to know that this is not an unusual experience. Things that are as familiar with us as we are with them simply seem to work better when they're with us. While this is a common example of what I mean by resonance, sometimes our connection with the world appears to us in a way that's less subtle and with a message that's harder to miss. In the spring of 1990, I'd left my career in the defense industry in Denver, Colorado, and I was living temporarily in San Francisco, California. During the daytime, I was developing seminars and writing my first book, while at night, I was working with a friend as a counselor. Specifically, I was providing guidance in the understanding of the power of human emotion in our lives and the role that it plays in our relationships. One of my first clients described a relationship that was a beautiful example of just how deep and just how literal our resonance with the world can be. She began by telling me about the long-term relationship she'd had with a man in her life. She described it as the never-ending date. For over 10 years, they'd been together in a relationship that seemed hopelessly stuck. Their conversations of marriage seemed to end in bitter disagreements, yet they didn't do well apart from one another either, and they wanted to share their lives together. Well, that evening, she described an experience of resonance that was so clear and so powerful, it leaves little doubt in our minds that such a relationship with our world exists. I began the evening by asking her to tell me what was new. "Tell me about your life in the past week," I said. "How are things at home?" "Oh, you wouldn't believe the things that have happened," she replied. "What a bizarre week. First, my boyfriend and I were watching TV on the couch, and we heard a loud crash in the bathroom. When we went in to see what had happened, you'll never guess what we saw." "Well, I couldn't begin to guess or even imagine," I said, "but now you've got me really interested. What happened?" "The hot water pipe under the sink had exploded and blown the door of the vanity right off its hinges and into the wall in front of the sink," she answered. "Wow," I said, "I've never heard of anything like that in my life." "Well, that's not all," she continued. "There's more. When we went to the garage to get the car, there was hot water all over the floor. The hot water heater had blown up and water was everywhere. Then, when we backed the car out of the garage into the driveway, the radiator hose on the car exploded and there was hot antifreeze all over the driveway." I listened to what this woman was saying and immediately recognized the pattern. "What was happening on that day in your house?" I asked. "How would you describe the vibe of your relationship?" She thought for a moment and she said, "That's easy. It'd been like a pressure cooker in the house." Realizing what she just said, immediately she became quiet. Just looked at me. "You don't think that the tension in our relationship has anything to do with what happened in the house, do you?" she asked. "Well, in my world," I said, "it has everything to do with what happened. We're tuned to our world, and the world shows us physically the energy of what we experience emotionally. Sometimes it's subtle, but in your case, it was very literal. Your house literally mirrored the pressure that you just described between you and your boyfriend, and it did so through the very essence that has been used for thousands of years to represent emotion. It did so through water. What a powerful, clear message you've received from this divine matrix," I said. "Now, what will you do with your message?" Well, whether we recognize our resonant connection with the world around us, it is real, and it exists through the divine matrix. Key number 17 reminds us of this connection, and it simply states that the divine matrix serves as the mirror in our world for the relationships that we create in our beliefs. If we have the wisdom to understand the messages that come to us through our surroundings, our relationship with the world around us can be a powerful teacher. Sometimes it can even save our lives. When the message is a warning. In my mother's life, next to her two sons, her very best friend has been her 12-pound bundle of energy wrapped up in the body of a border terrier named Corey Sue. While I travel frequently for tours and seminars, I do my best to call Mom at least once a week to check in and see how things are going in her life and let her know what's happening in mine. Well, just before my 2000 book tour for the God Code, I'd called Mom on a Sunday afternoon and she shared her concerns about her dog. I heard the concerns in Mom's voice as she described what was happening. Corey just hasn't been acting like herself or eating well, Mom said. So she'd taken her to a vet to see if there was a problem. During the examination, a series of x-rays were made and they showed something that no one was expecting. For some unexplained reason, Corey's films showed patches of small white spots all over her lungs, patches that shouldn't have been there. I've never seen anything like this in a dog before, the vet had said. She was absolutely mystified and decided to run more tests to see what the spots might be telling us about Corey. While Mom was obviously concerned about her dog, as I listened to her story, I became concerned for another reason. I shared with Mom the principle of resonance and how we're tuned to our world, our automobiles, our homes, and sometimes even our pets. I offered a number of case histories where animals have been documented to take on their owners' medical conditions weeks, sometimes even months, before the same conditions were found in the bodies of the people who cared for them. My sense was that something like this was probably happening between Corey and my mom. Well, after some convincing that life is full of such messages, Mom agreed to a checkup for herself. Although she was experiencing absolutely no discomfort, and from outward appearances had no reason to go to the doctor, she agreed to schedule a physical that included a chest x-ray. Well, you can probably tell where the story is headed, and the reason I'm sharing it here. To Mom's surprise, the x-rays revealed a suspicious spot on her lung as well, one that had not been there during her annual physical less than a year before. Further investigation showed that she had a scar in precisely the location that resulted from an illness that had healed itself years before during her childhood. Apparently, while the scar had healed, it had also become cancerous in her later years. Well, 3 weeks later, Mom underwent surgery. Lower 1/3 of her right lung was completely removed. As I spoke with the doctor in the recovery room after the surgery, he reiterated how lucky Mom was that the spot had been detected early, especially because there was no telltale symptom of any problems. Well, this is an example of how we can apply the mirrors in our lives. Because Mom and I had learned to read the messages that life was showing us, and we'd trusted the language enough to apply it in a practical way, this story has a happy ending. Mom recovered from her surgery, and she's doing great and has been cancer-free for 6 years. Interestingly enough, however, the spots in Corey's lungs that had originally alerted us to look into Mom's condition completely disappeared after Mom's surgery as well. She and Mom had another 6 years together in good health and with all of the joy they found in each other in their daily routines. While it may not be possible to prove scientifically that Corey's condition had anything whatsoever to do with what happened to Mom, we can say that the correlation between the two experiences is high. While we may not fully understand that correlation today, the truth is that we could study it for another 50 years and still not understand it fully. But what we can do, however, is to apply what we do know in our lives. And when we do, the events of our daily lives become a rich language, full of symbols and signs that offer insights into our most intimate secrets. Once again, in a world where life itself mirrors our deepest beliefs, there can be few things that are truly secret. Ultimately, it probably matters less how the unexpected curves of life come our way, and more about whether or not we recognize the language that warns us when they're coming. Our greatest fears. Because the divine matrix constantly reflects our beliefs, feelings, and emotions through the events of our lives, the everyday world gives us insights into the deepest realms of our hidden selves. In our personal mirrors, we're shown our true beliefs, our true loves and fears, and from this way of thinking of things, the world is a powerful and often literal mirror, and one that is not always easy to face. With complete honesty, life gives us a direct window into the ultimate reality of our beliefs. Sometimes our reflections come to us, however, in ways that we would never expect. I remember an incident that occurred in the Safeway grocery store of a Denver suburb one evening in 1989. I'd stopped on the way home from work, as I often did, to pick up a few things for dinner. As I wandered along the canned food section, I glanced up from my grocery list just long enough to notice that I was alone in the aisle, except for a young mother with a small girl seated in the shopping cart. They were obviously in a hurry and looked as if they were about as happy to be grocery shopping at the end of their day as I was. As my attention returned to comparing the names on my list to those on the cans, suddenly I was startled by the sound of a child's scream. And this was not just any old scream, with a volume and intensity that would have rivaled Ella Fitzgerald's "Is It Real or Is It Memorex" commercials. It was the young girl that I just noticed in the grocery cart. And she was terrified, absolutely terrified. Within a few seconds, the girl's mother stepped back into the aisle to calm her daughter down. Immediately, the girl stopped screaming and life in the store returned to normal for everyone. Well, while we've all seen something like this before, that night something seemed different to me. For some reason, rather than just ignoring an incident that happens so commonly, I really took a look at what was happening. My eyes instinctively searched the aisle to see why that young girl may have been screaming. And all that I saw was that the mother had momentarily stepped away from her cart, leaving her daughter of about 2 or 3 years of age alone just for a moment. And that was all. The girl was screaming simply because she was alone. But I wanted to know why. Why was the girl so frightened? Her mother had simply stepped away for an instant out of sight around the corner of another aisle. Why would a young child, surrounded by a world of colorful cans and pretty labels, with no one around to discourage any exploration, suddenly be so terrified at such a prospect? Why wouldn't she simply think to herself something like, "Hey, here I am alone with these beautiful cans of Campbell's soup, red and white. I think I'll just explore each one row at a time, and have a great time doing it"? Why would the prospect of being alone, even if it's only for a moment, touch something so deep in her at that early age that her instinct would be to scream at the top of her lungs? On another evening, I'd scheduled a counseling session with a woman that I'd worked with many times in the past. Our evening began as usual as the young woman in her mid-30s relaxed into the wicker chair in front of me. I asked her to describe what had happened during the course of the week since we'd last talked. She began telling me about her relationship with her husband of nearly 18 years. And for much of the marriage, they'd fought, sometimes violently. She'd been on the receiving end of what seemed like daily criticism of everything from the way she dressed to the way she ran the house, cooked the meals. Even in bed, she said, she felt like she was never good enough. While the treatment that she described was nothing new in their relationship, during the week that had passed, the situation had escalated. Her husband had become angry when she confronted him with questions about his overtime and late nights at the office. She was miserable with the man that she loved and trusted for so long. Now her misery was being compounded with a very real threat of physical harm. It was resulting from her husband's out-of-control emotions. Well, in the heat of their most recent fight, her husband had left the house, gone to live with a friend. He offered no phone number, no address, no indication of if or even when he'd ever come back. He was just gone. Suddenly, the man who had made this woman's life so miserable for so long, and had even threatened her physical safety, was gone at last. As she described his leaving, I waited for some sign of relief, a sign that I never saw. In its place, however, something truly astonishing began to happen. She began to sob uncontrollably in the realization that her husband was gone. And when I asked her to describe what she was feeling, what I heard was not the resolution or the relief that I'd expected. Instead, she was feeling the pain of being alone, in the sense that she would be alone for the rest of her life. She began describing her feelings using words like crushed, absolutely devastated in the absence of her husband. Now, in the opportunity to live free of criticism and insults and abuse, she was distressed. Just like the young girl in the supermarket aisle, once again, I asked the question, why? Well, the answer in each of these situations is the same. As different as each one appears from one another, there is a common thread that brings them both together, and that thread is this. There's a very good chance that the terror that the young girl experienced in the supermarket and the devastation felt by the woman actually had little to do with the people that left them in those moments. The girl's mother and the woman's husband both served as catalysts for a powerful yet subtle pattern that runs so deep within each of us that it's nearly unrecognizable. Often it's completely forgotten. That pattern is fear. And fear has many masks in our culture. Although it plays a key role in the way we build everything from our friendships and our careers to our romances and the health of our bodies, almost on a daily basis, fear surfaces in our lives in ways that we simply don't recognize, at least not immediately. What's even more interesting is that that pattern may not even be ours. When we find ourselves touched by an experience that forces powerful negative emotions to surface, we can rest assured that no matter what we may think has caused that fear to rise, there is a really good possibility that something very different is playing out. Something so deep and so primal that it's easy to overlook. That is, until it crosses our paths in a way that cannot be mistaken. Our universal fears. If you are listening to this program, the chances are good that you've already explored the many and varied relationships in your life. In your explorations, you no doubt have gained valuable insights into what people have triggered certain emotions and why. In fact, you probably know yourself so well that if I asked you to answer the questions about your life and your past, you could give me just the right answers to arrive at just the right conclusions for any therapeutic quiz that might be offered. And it's in those perfect and acceptable answers that you may miss the single, deepest pattern that's permeated your life from the day that you were born. It's for this very reason that I invite seminar participants to complete a pre-printed form that asks them to identify the greatest patterns of their childhood caretakers that they would consider as negative. And I ask for the negative patterns because I've rarely seen people get stuck in what we call the positive patterns of joy in their lives. Almost universally, the experiences that cause the problems in our lives have roots in what are considered negative feelings. And these are the feelings that we have about our experiences and what they mean to us in our lives. While we probably cannot change what has happened in the past, we can understand why we feel the way we do and change what the experience means to us today. So after completing the exercise, I asked the audience to randomly shout the characteristics that they've listed as the negative qualities for both their male and female caretakers. For many people, those caretakers are their birth parents, or for some, it's their foster parents, or for others, maybe they were raised by their older brothers, sisters, or relatives, or friends. Regardless of who it is, the question is with regard to the people who cared for them in their formative years until about the age of 15 or so. Well, if there's any shyness in the room, it quickly disappears as people begin to shout these negative qualities that they've written on their forms, and I'm writing them on a flip chart as they do. Immediately, something interesting begins to happen. Because as one person shares the words that describe their memory, someone else is offering the same feeling and often using exactly the same words. A sample of the terms often used to describe these characteristics of our primary caretakers, taken from a cross-section of programs, shows that nearly identical terms are used. The words that fill the chart are words like angry, judgmental, controlling, cold, abusive, unavailable, jealous, critical, strict, dishonest, fearful. And this is just a sample of the kinds of words that our audiences use to describe the negative characteristics of their primary caretakers. Well, there's a lightness that begins to fill the room, and people begin to laugh at what they're seeing. If we didn't know better, we'd think that we all came from the same family. The similarity of the words is more than just a coincidence. How can so many people from such diverse backgrounds have such a similar experience? The answer to this mystery is the pattern that runs deeply in the fabric of our collective consciousness, which may be described as our core or universal fears. Universal patterns of fear may be so subtle in their expression, yet so painful in memory, that we skillfully and masterfully create the masks that make them bearable in our lives. Similar to the way a painful family memory is always there, yet seldom discussed, we have unconsciously agreed to disguise the hurt of our collective past in ways that are socially acceptable. And we're so successful in masking our greatest fears that for all intents and purposes, the original reasons for our hurt are often forgotten, and all that remains is the acting out of their expression. Well, just as the woman losing her husband or the young girl in the supermarket were probably not aware of why they felt and reacted as they did, neither are we. Due to the ways we mask our fear, we never have to talk about our deepest hurts, yet they remain with us, lingering and unresolved until something happens and we can no longer simply look away. When we allow ourselves to look a little deeper into these powerful, unmasked moments of life, what we discover is that as different as all of our fears appear to be, they resolve to one of only three basic patterns, or a combination of these three universal fears. Key number 18 helps us to put a name on our fears so that we can identify and explore them deeper. And while there are seldom absolutes in life, this key reminds us that more often than not, the root of our negative experiences may be reduced to one or a combination of the three universal fears: abandonment, low self-esteem, or trust. Now that we've identified them, let's explore each one a little deeper. Our first universal fear: separation and abandonment. There's a feeling that runs through each of us that we're alone in this world. Through each person in every family, there's an unspoken sense that we're somehow separated from whoever or whatever is responsible for our existence. We feel that somewhere in the midst of our ancient memory, we were brought here and then abandoned without explanation or even reason. And why would we expect to feel any differently? In the presence of the science that can place a human on the moon and translate the genetic code, we still don't really know who we are. And we certainly don't know for sure how we got here. We sense our spiritual nature from within while we're looking outside of ourselves to validate our feelings. From literature and cinema to music and culture, we make a distinction between our place here on the earth and a distant heaven that's somewhere else. In the West, we affirm our separation from our Creator through our translation of the great prayer from the Bible that describes the relationship, the Lord's Prayer. For example, the common Western translation begins by stating, "Our Father who art in heaven," acknowledging this separation. In this translation, we're here while our Father is somewhere else, somewhere far away in heaven. When we look at the original Aramaic text, however, they offer a very different view of our relationship with our Heavenly Father. The translations of precisely the same phrase begin with the words, "Radiant One, you shine within us, outside us. Even darkness shines when we remember." What beautiful and powerful words. They reinforce the idea that our Creator is not separate from us and distant. Rather, the creative force of our Father, whatever meaning we give to it, is not only with us, it is us and permeates all that we know as our world. When we have a fear in our lives, even if we're not consciously aware of precisely what that fear is, it creates an emotional bias in our bodies, an experience often described as a charge or maybe just a hot button. Our charges show up in our lives as the strong ideas that we have as to the rightness or the wrongness or the way that an experience should play out. Our charges and our buttons are the promise that we will create the relationships that show us which fear is asking to be healed. In other words, our charges will show us our fears, and the greater the charge, the deeper the fear. Rarely are they wrong. So if you don't consciously remember your fear of separation and abandonment, for example, there is a good possibility that these fears will show up in your life in ways that you least expect, and probably during the times that are least convenient. In your romances, in your careers, your friendships, for example, do you find that you are the leaver or are you the leavee? In other words, are you the one who's always the last to know that the relationship is over? Do perfectly good marriages and careers and friendships seem to crumble before your eyes without warning for no apparent reason? And do you feel devastated when these relationships break or fail? Or maybe you're on the other side of these relationships. Do you always leave your careers, your romances, and friendships while they're still going strong just to make sure that you don't get hurt? Do you find yourself saying something like, "Wow, this is a perfect job, the perfect marriage, the perfect friendship. I think I'll quit now while things are good," before something happens and it gets painful. Well, if this kind of scenario has played out in your life in the past, or if it's doing so right now, there is a good possibility that it is you masterfully creating an acceptable way of masking what may be your deepest fears, those of abandonment and separation. By repeating these patterns in relationship after relationship, you may reduce the pain of your fear to a manageable level. It may even get you through your entire life. The trade-off, however, is that the pain becomes the diversion. It becomes your way of looking away from the universal fear that you were separated from the wholeness of your Creator, from a greater presence and left behind and eventually forgotten. How can you ever find love and closeness that you long for if you're always leaving or always being left behind just when you get close? Our second universal fear, low self-worth. Almost universally, a feeling runs through every person in every culture and within each society of our world that we are somehow just not good enough. We fear that we're not good enough to be recognized for our contributions to our families and communities and in our workplace. We fear that we're not good enough to be honored and respected as a human being. Sometimes we even surprise ourselves with the feelings that we're not good enough to be alive. While this sense of low self-worth may not always be conscious, it's always there and provides an underlying foundation for the way we approach life and our relationships with other people. As masters of emotional survival, we often find ourselves playing out the real-life scenarios that equate to our imaginary sense of self-worth. For example, we all have the dreams, desires, and aspirations of accomplishing great things in our lives, and more often than not, we rationalize all the reasons why we will never have those things. As we've seen in earlier chapters, feeling is a language unto itself, and is the very language that the divine matrix responds to. So when we feel as though we cannot accomplish our dreams, the matrix simply gives us back what we've offered it to work with, the delays, the challenges, and the obstacles that fulfill that feeling. Although we may wish, want, and dream of greater things, the doubt that comes from deep within us ultimately derives from our feelings of low self-worth. We wonder, am I good enough to have such joy in my life? Why would we expect to feel any differently? In the Western Judeo-Christian tradition, we have been told by those who we trust and respect precisely these things, that we are somehow lesser beings, that we are not as good as the angels of the heavens or the saints that we learn from. The same tradition has convinced many people that just by being in this world, that we need to be redeemed from life itself for reasons that we're told are beyond anything we could even understand. Through the 2,000-year-old story of Jesus, for example, we're compared to the edited, condensed, and preferred memory of one man's life, a life that we can never live up to. Sometimes the comparisons are serious, suggesting that we may be condemned to a tough afterlife if we don't live a certain way. Sometimes they're a little lighter and simply remind us of our inadequacy by asking sarcastic questions. People will say things like, "Who do you think you are? Jesus Christ? How are you going to get there from here? You're going to walk on water?" How many times have you heard these or similar comparisons made, suggesting that although you may try your best to live a good life, that you'll never be as good or as worthy as the master of the past? Although we seldom take such comments seriously, on a deep level, they still remind us, they touch that part of us that remembers that we are somehow undeserving of life's greatest joys, and we believe it. Even if you have high self-esteem, on some level, you may believe these suggestions. Ultimately, on some level, we all probably do. As a result, we express our beliefs through the expectations of our success, how much joy we allow ourselves, how much success in our relationships. Our fear of not being worthy enough to have love, acceptance, health, and longevity promises that every one of our relationships will reflect that fear of low worth to some degree, and, as we mentioned earlier, it happens in ways we would never expect in a million years. For example, how many times have you settled for relationships that are not what you really want, but rationalize them by saying things like, "Well, this is good enough for now," or "This is a stepping stone to something better"? Have you ever found yourself saying, "I'd love to share my life with a loving, compassionate, nurturing, and caring partner, but," and then all the reasons why this can't happen. Or this is the job where I can really express my gifts and my talents, but followed by all the reasons that your greatest dreams can't be realized in that moment. Well, if these or similar scenarios have played out in your life, there's a good chance that they are skillfully created masks that you use to question your own worth. Through your personal and business relationships, you remind yourself of your core beliefs about yourself, beliefs that ask for a greater healing. Our third universal fear, surrender and trust. Have you ever experienced a relationship of any kind where your level of trust was so complete that you were able to surrender your personal self in exchange for knowing a greater self? And to be clear here, I'm not suggesting that you give yourself and all of your personal power away in any experience. On the contrary, the experience that I'm asking about is one where you have such a strong sense of who you are that you allow yourself to let go of your beliefs of what or who you should be in exchange for a greater possibility of what you may become. Well, almost universally, there is a feeling within each of us that it's not safe to do so. It's not safe to trust other people, the wisdom of our bodies, or the peace of our world. And why should we think any differently? We need look no further than the evening news to give ourselves plenty of reasons to justify our feeling and our fear. Every day, we're shown examples of behavior that seem to justify and even perpetuate the sense that we live in a frightening and dangerous world. From the terror and the murder, the assaults that we see in the big world to the violations of trust and betrayals that we experience in our personal lives, in the myriad health concerns that we're cautioned to watch for every day, this planet that we call home certainly can look like a really scary place. But ultimately, our sense of safety in the world must come from the safety that we feel inside of ourselves. And to feel that safety, we must trust. We must ask ourselves, if we trust in the intelligence of the universe that's inherent within all situations of life. If our answer to this question is no, then we must ask ourselves the next question, and that is why? Who or what experience taught us that our world is not safe and it's not safe to trust? Do you trust in the process of life, for example? When you or a loved one or a pet finds that life has thrown an unexpected curve, do you immediately go to the place of blame so that you can feel safe? When your children walk out the door to go to school in the morning, do you worry that something might happen and that they'll not be safe? Or do you know with every cell in your being that they are safe until you feel the joy of welcoming them home when the bus drops them off at 3:30 in the afternoon? Although all the frightening things that we see happening around us are certainly real, they are part of reality. The key to overriding our fears is that they do not necessarily need to be part of our reality. And while this may seem like a naive New Age philosophy, it's actually a very ancient belief that is now supported by leading-edge science. What we know about the divine matrix is this: it exists. We know that it reflects in our lives what we think, what we feel, what we emote, and what we believe. What we truly believe in our hearts and in our minds. We know that the subtle shift in the way we see ourselves is all that's needed for that change to be mirrored in our health, careers, and our relationships. And this is where the true nature of this vicious cycle of fear becomes apparent. If we want something to change, we have to break the cycle and give the matrix something different to work with, something different to reflect. Sounds simple, doesn't it? Maybe deceptively simple. Changing the way we see ourselves is probably the most difficult practice that we'll ever be faced with. Because of our inner beliefs, we experience in our outer world the great battle that's playing out within our hearts and our minds, the hearts and minds of every person on this planet, the battle that defines who we believe we are. And it's within the presence of all the reasons not to trust that we are asked to find a way out of the prison that fear locks us into. Each day, the experiences of your life are asking you to show yourself how much you can trust, not to just blindly trust for no reason, but to really trust and really feel safe and secure in this world because you know that you are. And just because we recognize the universal fears in our relationships doesn't necessarily mean that we'll no longer experience them in our lives. It's precisely because they are so deep and universal that they seem to be so common in our collective experience. But once we become aware of them, however, they no longer have to catch us off guard. They no longer have the same negative impact upon us. And recognizing how they play out in everything, from our most intimate relationships to our health and even our material and spiritual abundance, when our fears do come up, it's no longer a mystery as to why we may have responded to them in a reactive way in the past. Now we can see them coming. When that familiar feeling of not being good enough for our dream job or relationship comes around, we can say, oh yeah, I remember this feeling, but it doesn't mean the same thing to me any longer. And in that difference, our healing begins. Chapter 7, Reading the Mirrors of Relationship. Messages from ourselves. As the last section has shown, the divine matrix provides the quantum mirror that shows us in our world what we've created in our beliefs. Through our relationships with other people, we're shown the clearest examples of what those beliefs really are. Sometimes our mirrors are obvious, and we say, so, that's the way things work. Sometimes the mirrors surprise us by reflecting the subtle reality of a judgment that's very different from what we had thought we believed. And this is the value of understanding how the divine matrix not only connects us and bridges us with our outer world, but it reveals the things about ourselves that are sometimes the most difficult to see. Regardless of what the mirrors teach us, it's by spending time with other people that those people become the triggers for just the right feelings and just the right beliefs at precisely the right times in our lives to help us heal our greatest hurts and our deepest wounds. It's our relationships that show us our greatest joys and our deepest loves, as well as our fears. Our relationships with other people, as well as those that we have with ourselves, are our opportunity to see ourselves in every way you could ever think of, from the greatest betrayals of our trust to our most desperate attempts to fill our emptiness. Everyone from our office mates, classmates, life mates, shows us something about ourselves if we have the wisdom to recognize the messages that were being mirrored to us. We discover the beliefs that cause the suffering in our own lives. I've met people that tell me they're taking a break from all relationships, or that they'll never be in another one because they're just too painful. Well, the truth is that we're always in relationship with someone or something. Even if we live on a mountaintop and never see another human being, we must still interact with that mountain and ourself. And in those interactions, we'll be shown the true reflection of our core beliefs. The reason? Our mirrors in the world never stop. They're always working. There is no escape, and the mirrors never lie. It's in this principle that we find what may be our greatest instrument of self-examination and self-realization. Key number 19 reminds us that our true beliefs are mirrored in our most intimate relationships. And it's the divine matrix that provides the neutral surface for our mirrors. Without judging our choices or our actions as right or wrong or good or bad, the matrix simply reflects what we project upon it. The question is whether or not we understand the language of those reflections. Or maybe a better way to ask this question is, do we recognize the messages that we're sending to ourselves as the divine matrix? In the 20th century, Science of Mind founder Ernest Holmes stated, quote, "Life is a mirror and will reflect back to the thinker what he thinks into it," end of quote. Well, numerous ancient traditions recognized this relationship and valued the mirrors of relationships as the path to wholeness and union with the divine. In the Coptic, Gnostic, and Essene texts that were discovered as part of the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945, for example, we're shown a series of mirrors that will face everyone at some point in their lives. Although they may always be present, it seems that there's an order to the way we recognize them. It's in these spiritual traditions it was believed that as our hurtful feelings are healed, we master the patterns that allow that hurt to exist. So in other words, to master the fear that may be in our lives today, we must first master the patterns that allow that fear to exist. Chapter 8, Rewriting the Reality Code, 20 Keys to Conscious Creation. Should be obvious by now that we are holographic beings. Should also be obvious that we're living in a holographic consciousness of a holographic universe. We're powerful beings expressing through bodies that extend well beyond the edge of ourselves to become merged with nothing less than the universe itself. By simply being who we are, we encompass the whole of creation, mirroring everything from the largest phenomenon to the most minute occurrence, and from the lightest of the light to the darkest of the dark. Your friends are part of that whole, as well as your brothers and sisters, your husband, your wife, your parents, your children. Our bodies mirror the patterns of the universe, embedded within the patterns of the universe, embedded within the patterns of the universe, and so on. In this way of thinking, everything that we could ever imagine, and probably things we've never even considered, are possible. Just as software programs like Word and PowerPoint change the output that comes from our computers, feeling and belief and prayer are the programs that change the output that comes from our consciousness expressed in the divine matrix. The beauty of this analogy is that we already have these powerful programs of reality making, and we already know how to use them. I can say this with absolute certainty because each of us does so every single day. Our lives seem to work this way. Each of us reflects for others different pieces of the whole. We're reminded of precisely this principle in the ancient Hermetic tenet of as above, so below, as within, so without. As physicist John Wheeler stated, we may be like cosmic feedback loops in the universe, with the same pattern repeating itself again and again on different levels of scale. Well, taking this idea one step further, ancient traditions suggest that the experienced loop of life continues for as long as it takes for us to find our greatest healing. It's then that we're released from the cycle, or as the Hindu beliefs describe, our karma becomes complete. Someone must do it first. So what do we do with all of this knowledge about connectedness and holograms and healing and the divine matrix? If we're so connected, then what happens if one person chooses to respond a new way to an old and hurtful pattern? What happens, for example, if one person chooses to respond to their betrayal or their violated trust with something more than old hurt and passionate anger? What do you think happens in a family when one member begins to watch the 6 o'clock news without feeling the need for revenge or to get even with those who have wronged and violated others? I can tell you precisely what happens, and it's this. That one person becomes a living bridge, both a pioneer and a midwife, for every other person with the courage to choose the same path. Each time someone else makes the same choice, it becomes a little easier and a little easier because someone else has done it first. As we discovered earlier, the key to their success is that to do so, each person must transcend the things that hurt them without getting lost in the experience. In other words, Martin Luther King, for example, could not have brought an end to hate by hating. Nelson Mandela could not have survived over 2 decades in a South African prison if he had hated those who had imprisoned him. His hate would have consumed him. In the same way, it's impossible to end war by creating more wars. We've seen a powerful example of precisely this principle in our inability to find global peace in the 20th century and now the 21st century. The bottom line is simply this. In a universe that mirrors our beliefs, it's clear that angry people cannot create a peaceful world. We've tried. And the instability of the world today is a testament to where those efforts have led. Well, in our examples of those who have changed oppression from within the oppression itself, 2 very powerful patterns have emerged. The first is that the choice to see beyond the hate originates from within the same system that spawns the hate, rather than being imposed from something outside of that source. The second principle is that the people who make the choice become the living bridge for those that they love the most. They find their truest power by living their truth in a system that doesn't always support their beliefs. And this leads to our 20th and final key for the reality code of the divine matrix. Though it may appear deceptively simple, we now understand why it is that we must become in our lives the very things that we choose to experience in our world, and that's the key. What a powerful model Holographic consciousness provides for a change made anywhere in the system to become a change everywhere in the system. Even with 6 billion plus people now sharing our world, we all benefit to some degree from the choices of peace and healing that are held by only a few. I can say that with certainty because we've witnessed this principle at work. Through our knowledge of the divine matrix, we now have everything we need to embrace our own power, to create and address the great challenges of our time and history, whether we're choosing peace in our world or peace in our families, healing in our loved ones or healing in ourselves. The principles are precisely the same. In our analogy of the universe as a consciousness computer, with feelings, emotions, and beliefs and prayers being the programs, it makes perfect sense that we would have an instruction manual that highlights the steps of reality making. And we do. Through the ages, the most enlightened masters have shared it with us in bits and pieces, however. The keys that follow are drawn from their teachings, the teachings of our past, as well as the best science of today, and they're designed to lead us step by step through the sequence of understanding and the actions that has proven to create change in the past. And while there are certainly other keys, it is this time-tested sequence that follows that's been effective throughout history as well as in my own personal experience. And for that reason, it's offered here as an abbreviated how-to manual for upgrading our programs of reality and changing our beliefs of the world. The 20 keys to reality making. So here are the keys that encapsulate the highlights of everything that we've explored in this book. Individually, they're interesting. Together, however, they tell a story. It's our story. When we read these keys as a code, they become a reminder of our role in the universe and our power to create. We can literally think of these keys as the software that our consciousness computer uses for reality making, our codes to create and change. And as with any code, the keys are in a sequence for a reason. Simply put, just as we need to have all of the ingredients in place before we begin to bake a cake, our keys to reality making work only if each step of the process is understood and available to us when we need it. So I invite you to consider the following sequence of keys one at a time. Allow each its own merit as a powerful agent of change. Work with it until it makes sense to you. Together, these steps can become your code for changing the world and changing yourself. The 20 keys of conscious creation. Key number 1. The divine matrix is the container that holds the universe, the bridge between all things, and the mirror that shows us what we've created. Key number 2. Everything in our world is connected to everything else. Key number 3. To tap the force of the universe itself, we must see ourselves as part of the world rather than separate from the world. Key number 4. Once something is joined, it's always connected, whether or not it remains physically linked. Key number 5. The act of focusing awareness is an act of creation unto itself. Consciousness creates. Key number 6. We already have all of the power we need to create all of the change we choose. Key number 7. The focus of your feelings becomes the reality of your world. Key number 8. To simply say that we choose a new reality is not enough. Key number 9. Feeling is the language that speaks to the divine matrix. Feel as though your goal is accomplished. Your prayer is already answered. Key number 10. Not just any feeling will do. The feelings that create must be without ego and without judgment. Key number 11. The secret to lasting effects in our prayers is to maintain the feeling as if the outcome has already happened. Key number 12. We're not bound by the laws of physics, at least as we know those laws today. Key number 13. In a holographic something, every piece of the something mirrors the whole something. Key number 14. The universally connected hologram of consciousness promises that the instant you create your good wishes and prayers, they are already at their destination and they are already received. Key number 15. Through the hologram of consciousness, a little change in our lives is mirrored everywhere in our world. Key number 16. The minimum number of people required to jumpstart a change in consciousness is expressed in the formula of the square root of 1% of a population. Key number 17. The divine matrix serves as the mirror in our world for the relationships that we create in our beliefs. Key number 18. The root of our negative experiences may be reduced to one or a combination of only 3 universal fears: abandonment, low self-worth, and trust. Key number 19. Our true beliefs are mirrored in our most intimate relationships. Key number 20. We must become in our lives the very things that we choose to experience as our world. The reminders of our miraculous potential are all around us. Earlier in this program, I suggested that the anomalies of quantum particles could be something more than simply strange and spooky behavior. I asked if it's possible that the freedom these particles have to move in time and space is really showing us a freedom that might be possible in our lives as well. Our bodies are made of precisely those same particles. Well, following all of the experiments, the research, and the demonstration of those who have transcended the limits of their own beliefs, I believe that the answer to this question is yes. If the particles that we're made of can be in instantaneous communication with one another, if they can be in 2 places at once, if they can live in the past as well as in the future and even change history through choices made in the present, then surely we can as well. The only difference between those isolated particles and us is that we're made of a lot of particles and we're held together by the power of consciousness itself. The ancient mystics reminded our hearts, and modern experiments have proven to our minds that the single most powerful force in the universe is something that already lives within each of us. And that's the great secret of creation itself. It's the power to create in the world what we imagine in our beliefs. And while it may sound too simple to be true, I believe that the universe works precisely this way, and the evidence supports that belief. When the Sufi poet Rumi stated that we're afraid of our own immortality, maybe what he meant was that it's actually our power to heal the very conditions that steal away life itself that truly frightens us. Maybe all we need is a little shift to see that we are the architects of our world and our fate, cosmic artists expressing our inner beliefs on the canvas of the universe itself. If we can remember that we are the art as well as the artist, then maybe we can also remember that we are the seed of the miracle as well as the miracle itself. If we can make that one small shift, then we are already healed in the divine matrix.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.